Hi, my name is Kerry Unsworth. I'm from the University of Western Australia in the Business School, and I wanted to talk to you today about workplace interventions designed to increase pro-environmental behaviour and to explore some ideas around why they aren't as successful as we would hope they would be. At the university where I work, they've recently tripled the cost of parking in the hope of discouraging people to drive to work and to commute using public transport instead. I'm a big believer in public transport. I've got strong green values, but there are still days when I wake up and think of all of the things I need to do at work and voila, suddenly I'm in my car driving to work. Why hasn't the increase in parking costs worked? A long history of economic theory says that it should. I've heard of other similar stories of workplace interventions that, although they're based on sound psychological or economic theory, they also haven't worked. Why is that? My colleagues and I set out to try and find the answer. Now, I should start out by saying that we're not trying to come up with yet another intervention. Instead, we're proposing that there isn't going to be any one silver bullet intervention that an organisation can roll out. Now, this might be a fairly controversial statement. I certainly know that it means that it makes it much more difficult for organisations who want their employees to do more pro-environmental behaviours. And it would be nice if we could believe that all they had to do was to make one set of changes and the company would be more environmentally sustainable. Unfortunately, the evidence just isn't there. Instead, we think that there are psychological and situational factors that make people more likely to take these behaviours on board. Now, we started this by thinking about what pro-environmental behaviours look like in the workplace for an employee. Now, you all know when you're working, you have a whole set of things that you need to achieve and a huge range of behaviours that you need to engage in throughout the day. If you've got 5 minutes before your next meeting, you need to decide whether or not you'll spend that time walking up the stairs or whether you'll spend it finalising a report before getting the quicker elevator. You're likely to be juggling efficiency goals, service and relationship goals, family goals and career ambition goals on top of any other green goals that you might have. But what is surprising is that our current understanding of workplace pro-environmental behaviour doesn't explicitly take these different goals and behaviours into account. It tends to look at green behaviours in isolation. And we think this might be why the interventions aren't working. Now, our model is pretty complex, but we'll see how we go. Essentially, we're saying that there are 3 factors which need to be in place before any workplace intervention will be successful over the long term: self-concordance, activated pathways, and a lack of goal conflict. As we go through these factors, I'll also be talking about other outcomes that can emerge from these situations. Not just looking at the behaviour that the intervention was based on, but trying to identify some of the unforeseen consequences that can happen following a workplace intervention. So, here goes. We'll start with the easy one. The first factor that needs to be present is self-concordance. The idea behind self-concordance is that it's the degree to which a behaviour expresses the person's stable interests and values. So turning off my lights at work might reflect my green values. It expresses those values, it is linked to those values. And this part of it's nothing new. 2 of the long-standing theories in pro-environmental literature recognise the importance of the person's values and attitudes. But there are 2 points of difference. First, we're not saying that the value has to be a green value. Turning off the lights would be just as self-concordant if it expressed a person's value of saving money and creating wealth. And second, the link between the behaviour and the value has to be recognised by the person. This might not be conscious, but being asked about it, they have to be able to say that they're engaging in this behaviour because of this value. The previous theories were based more upon the idea that if the pro-environmental value was there, or the pro-environmental attitudes were there, then the behaviour would follow. Now, workplace interventions are typically a one-size-fits-all approach for all employees. This means that it's highly likely that the behaviour they're trying to change will be self-concordant for some people, but not for others. For those employees for whom the behaviour is self-concordant, they're more likely to 1. Choose the behaviour over others because it's consistent with their values. 2. Be more motivated in pursuing the behaviour because it's linked to a higher order goal and this imbues it with a kind of motivating potential. And 3. They're going to feel happier about engaging in it because it's helping to achieve an important value. On the other hand, the employee for whom the behaviour is not self-concordant is highly unlikely to choose to engage in it, or if they do, they're likely to give up at the first hurdle through a lack of motivation and positive emotions. Another interesting implication comes out of this, particularly for those employees for whom the behaviour is not self-concordant. Some workplace interventions require, or strongly encourage, employees to engage in the behaviour using external controls such as policies, procedures, or structural changes to the offices. Because these control the employee, it's highly likely that these employees do engage in the behaviour relevant to the particular intervention. They don't have a choice. But we think that it will result in what is called the rebound effect. This is where people might engage in a green behaviour, but then they do something else which completely negates the first behaviour. For instance, a friend of mine installed solar panels because there was a government rebate allowing him to buy them relatively cheaply. But as soon as he had them installed, he bought himself an energy-sucking big-screen TV because he figured that he'd done his bit. There's no higher-order goal being activated in this situation. He was doing the pro-environmental behaviour just to complete the behaviour, so as soon as it's done, he moves on to other goals, such as a leisure goal and having a big screen TV. So, self-concordance is important, and dealing with this would be difficult enough. But as complicating as this makes it, unfortunately it's still too simple. There's more. The remaining factors are based on goal hierarchy and goal systems theories. Goal hierarchies are our way of visualising how a person represents the goals that they have. At the top of the ladder are the person's values. These could be green values, ambition, safety and security, compassion, and so on. At the very bottom of the ladder are the person's day-to-day tasks. At work, these could be answering emails, going to meetings, writing reports, meeting clients, and so on. Of course, within these task goals are a myriad of subtasks and sub-goals that help you to actually achieve the things you do. We're less interested in those, and we focus more on the behaviours at the task level. In between the values and the day-to-day behaviours are a person's identities. For example, being a good employee, a parent, a community leader, a football coach, a teacher, a friend, and so on. And their long-term project goals, such as teamwork or development and training, getting a promotion, completing a project, renovating the house, and so on. Each of these goals at the different stages of the hierarchy will have different levels of importance depending upon the situation. For example, on a Saturday morning, being a football coach might be the most important identity, but 2 days later on a Monday morning, it's the least important identity. We call this the salience of a goal, whether it's perceived to be important at that particular point in time. Another key aspect of goal hierarchies is that the goals are related. I might perceive that resolving issues and concerns is related to teamwork, but that it's not really related to my development and training. So how does this help us understand how we can change employees' pro-environmental behaviours? Well, as you'll remember, I said earlier that the behaviour needed to be self-concordant for a workplace intervention to work for an employee. But what if the value that the behaviour was self-concordant with wasn't salient at the time? Let's say the employee thinks that taking public transport to work expresses their value of being healthy because they have to walk to the bus stop, and this value is important to them mainly because of their identity as a football coach. The behaviour then has high levels of self-concordance. And on a Saturday morning, no doubt all sorts of intentions are formed regarding the upcoming prospect of getting public transport to work the following week. But the next week comes around and suddenly the employee identity is salient and the football coach identity has been shielded. Now, although the behaviour is self-concordant, it's not top of mind. In fact, from what we know about how people deal with goals, we know that it's the same as having been forgotten. So our second factor is whether or not the behaviour is a focal behaviour or a background behaviour. If it is self-concordant and focal, then the employee will engage in the behaviour. If it is self-concordant and background, then they won't. Two interesting sidelines come from this line of thinking. The first is the continuation of the behaviour. A goal hierarchy is like a neural network. Over time, the paths linking behaviours to the higher order goals become stables, kind of like goat paths through a garden. As soon as one part of that path within the whole hierarchy is activated, then it automatically activates the rest of the path, meaning that the behaviour will likely take place. This is important when it comes to pro-environmental interventions. Interventions often work over the short term when there are constant reminders of the behaviour or when you're forced to engage in it through policies. If the behaviour is self-concordant, then over time the link between the behaviour and the other higher order values becomes one of these goat paths, meaning that any activation of any part of that linked network will lead to the activation of the behaviour. What does this mean? Essentially, it means that the behaviour is going to be continued in the long term, as there's many more possibilities of it being a focal behaviour. The second sideline is whether or not the behaviour spills over into other pro-environmental behaviours and/or other contexts. Engaging in the behaviour because of an intervention will activate any other higher order goals that the behaviour is linked to in the hierarchy. This activation then leads to a need to be consistent with other behaviours, particularly if this higher order goal is not perceived to be completed. Let's take an example to make it clearer. An employee with a green goal might perceive that recycling at home, getting public transport to work, turning off the coffee machine, and turning off the lights are all related to fulfilling their green goal. When this employee takes part in a workplace intervention designed to increase recycling, their green goal becomes activated, which then increases the motivation to engage in these other related behaviours until that green goal is perceived to be completed. So spillover occurs when the behaviour is self-concordant and part of an activated path, but when it doesn't fully complete the person's green goal. So we've looked at how self-concordance, goal activation and perceived completion of a goal all affect the outcomes of a workplace intervention. The last one is, to me, the most interesting, and I think the one that's most relevant for pro-environmental interventions and most relevant for employees, and that is goal conflict. Goal conflict is particularly relevant for employee pro-environmental behaviour, as employees are likely to have many other goals that will be activated that will not be associated with their green goal. For example, for many employees, spending time and/or resources in accomplishing green goals, such as taking public transport to work, taking longer to walk up the stairs, rather than getting the quicker elevator and so on, may be in conflict with performance efficiency goals, such as getting to the meeting on time, or spending every last available minute working on the computer. And for most employees, their performance goals will be much more commonly activated than their green goals. Goal conflict reduces the resources and motivation put towards the focal goal. So let's say an employee is focused on achieving a green goal based on a workplace intervention. For instance, he or she might be getting ready to climb the stairs rather than taking the elevator. But on the way there, they run into a colleague who reminds them of a report due next week. In this case, it's likely that an efficiency performance goal will create conflict with the green goal and create negative emotions. And he or she will take the elevator instead because it's quicker. Interestingly though, research has shown that this conflict doesn't even need to be in our conscious awareness. There's been a lot of research, very scary stuff, which shows how subconscious activation of other goals leads to goal conflict. In the workplace, this could be pictures, notices on the notice board, the route the employee has to walk, and so on. All of these could trigger unrelated or opposing goals that could stop the employee from engaging in the green behaviour. So, all up, what do we have? Basically, given the complexity incorporated in the model, it's not surprising that many of these workplace interventions don't have long-term success. Such success comes only for employees for whom the behaviour is self-concordant and part of an activated path, and who do not experience goal conflict. Despite this, our model suggests that there are things that could be done to improve the success. Changing the workplace environment to include more positive environmentally related cues should help in activating employees' green goals. These cues should be placed in areas where the employees will be choosing to engage in the behaviour, as well as actually engage in the behaviour. And while we haven't had time to talk about it, our model suggests that these should be positive cues rather than cues that might engender negative affect, such as reprimands or guilt-inducing notices. When these positive environmental cues are available, then the intervention will most likely lead to greater behaviour change. I started this podcast by thinking about how a workplace intervention didn't work for me. For me, not driving into work was self-concordant, as commuting on public transport expressed my values and beliefs. But when I experienced goal conflict, the resources allocated to the green behaviour were reduced, and I chose to pursue the alternative efficiency goal by driving in my car. There are many other situations where pro-environmental interventions haven't worked, and we hope that our model can start to explain those. There are lots of very good workplace pro-environmental interventions out there. We hope that by looking at the underlying conditions that I've talked about today, we can start to increase their success. If you would like any more information, or if you would like to cite any of the ideas or work that I've mentioned in this, please don't hesitate to contact me, as we are in the middle of getting some of this work published. Thank you. Bye.